Hello, my loves, and welcome back to yet another episode of Strange Playgrounds. Now, my mind has been on a very particular kind of horror recently. It's a kind of horror that seems to be in the ascendancy, certainly within, say, independent cinema or small studio cinema. There seems to be this upsurge in a very peculiar kind of horror, and it's a kind of horror that I absolutely adore. I mean, that the very notion of horror is such a broad church. I mean, it's not monolithic or glacial. It is actually it's an ocean, it's a universe filled with various different forms of unpleasant, distressing, horribly portentous stars. It's the broadest, most open, most various of genres, as its siblings are fantasy and science fiction. People tend to make some mistakes when they use those terms. They seem to think or preconceive that they are very narrow or very defined, and really they're not. Nor are they very clear. I mean, these things bleed into one another and overlap and sort of integrate all the time, along with lots of other different types of genre. And the particular kind of horror that I'm talking about is emphasized by the likes of The Babadook, by the recent British horror film Possum, by Matt Holness, the guy who wrote, directed, and starred in Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. It's emphasized by the likes of The Witch and Hereditary and Midsommar. It seems to be everywhere at the moment. It's the kind of horror that doesn't deal with superficial physical threats, that doesn't deal with a monster attacking people, or that doesn't deal with some masked psychopath stalking babysitters. It's not about that. It's a kind of, I suppose if you were going to place a label on it, it would be a kind of psychological horror, but it's also intermingled with elements of folk horror and mythological horror. What you tend to find is currently efflorescing, not only in independent cinema, but in independent fiction as well, is the kind of horror that blurs the lines between the waking world and the world of the subconscious. It's the kind of horror that projects an internal reality onto the external, or that dissolves those parameters entirely, that makes those distinctions absolutely meaningless. And I've got to say, it's a kind of horror that I always respond to. I always respond to it. I absolutely love that kind of fiction, where there isn't a distinction between the internal and the external, where people can where characters can affect reality through their emotional and psychological states. I love that. Where reality itself becomes a kind of protean and movable feast, and where internal sicknesses and traumas can infect and even tear open or vandalize existing reality. I adore it. I absolutely adore it. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to do well. Very, very hard to do well. Of those films that I just mentioned, all of them are very successful, with the least successful probably being Hereditary, despite it being the one with the biggest budget and with the biggest release. Not a bad film. Not a bad film by any stretch, as fans of this channel will know. It's just that it has a very weak third act. A very weak third act because it ends up defining what is real and what is not. And that's always a mistake. That's always a mistake in this kind of fiction. What tends to happen is, I think writers sometimes get cold feet. I think they enjoy playing with the ambiguity, but then they tend to get cold feet and underestimate their audience. They tend to underestimate their watchers or their readers and think that they have to define very clearly what's happening. And that's often death for this kind of story. It often presents something that's far too narrow, that's far too simplistic. And when it comes to exploring vicissitudes of the mind, when it comes to mental sickness or mental or emotional trauma, that kind of distinction, that kind of clarity just doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist, because in a very real way, that kind of trauma, the neurosis, trauma, sickness of the mind does affect physical reality in the sense that it affects perceptions of reality. And if your perception of reality is affected, then reality itself is affected, because that's our definition. That's what we use to engage with reality. It's the bedrock, It's the means by which reality is defined. So if we have distortions of reality afflicting us, then our reality itself is distorted. That's what this kind of fiction tends to try to explore and to exclaim, and I love it. I absolutely love it. In the realm of independent fiction, there are so many pieces of work that are exploring this right now. So many. We've already talked about Sing Your Sadness Deep by Laura Marrow. There's All the Fabulous Beasts by Priya Sharma, which is absolutely frigging brilliant. The House of Wounds by Georgina Bruce, just unbelievable. I will leave links to all of these down below because they explore this exact thing in such beautiful detail. But the one I really want to talk about today is a collection by Phil Sloman. It's a collection called Broken on the Inside, which is a collection of 5 sort of short stories stretching to novellas. They're rather long short stories, each of which explores a particular tension between what's happening within the protagonist's perceptions of reality and reality itself. Each and every one of them is an examination of particular neuroses or particular tensions between waking reality and dreaming reality. And it's very distressing. It's very, very distressing because these stories are about the breaking down of the mind. And as a result of that, the breaking down of reality around the protagonists who are suffering various forms of mental illness. What I really loved about this collection, first of all, it's the kind of fiction, a kind of horror I respond to so well. I respond to so well because what Phil draws is it's not like my fiction, which is really abstruse and mythological, and that's what I write. That's what I'm good at. Phil's fiction is very grounded in a very gritty, very immediate and recognizable reality. The moment the stories begin, you know where you are. You know the situation, you know the circumstances that are often fueling the mental illnesses of the protagonists. Each of these protagonists finds themselves in situations that aren't conducive to mental health. They are not conducive to emotional well-being. I mean, the title story, Broken on the Inside, features a situation that many of us will recognize. It's written from the perspective of a woman named Kira, who is in not the best situation in her life. She's having difficulties. We know she's having difficulties. We know that she's been ill, and that the illness was rather serious, that she's living at home with her mother, that there is some significant tensions because of that. It feels like at the beginning of this story that Kira has lost a lot of herself, that she has lost a lot of her world as a result of this illness. You're not told. What I love about the story more than anything is Phil takes great pains to make sure that the reader isn't told what's happening. There aren't instances where the characters are sitting around talking about, oh, this has happened and this has happened, as though they're talking to the audience. They talk to one another very naturally. So what you have to do as the audience, you're sort of dropped in. There's a voyeuristic quality to the story that I really like, whereby you have to watch from a kind of distance, and almost a perverse distance almost, watch these tensions play out, and you have to watch the gradual degeneration of Kira herself. And then there is this wonderful, almost a twist in a way. There's a sort of Black Mirror science fiction element. Kira is seeing a doctor, Dr. Seacombe, and she undergoes some rather radical surgery, or so she seems to assume. And she's implanted with this device that tells her what she should steer clear of. It speaks in her head and tells her what circumstances she should steer clear of, what food, when her emotional state is affecting her health. It's really interesting. It's such an interesting concept, and you can imagine where it goes. I'm sure, I don't want to spoil too much, but you can imagine where this goes. It is not the panacea that it initially seems to be. Let's put it that way. Things get very dark. It's about initial, and the story has some really interesting twists and turns as well. Initially, it feels like it's going to be an exploration of invasive technology, very much in the style of Black Mirror, very much in the style of a science fiction short story. But that's not necessarily the case. It's a very interesting work that plays with the audience, that plays with their assumptions and their perceptions, and in that regard, it kind of communicates to the audience the same things that Kiro is experiencing. This situation where you're being lied to. You are actually being lied to by the story, by the writer. And that's a brilliant thing. You're kind of being manipulated into assuming one thing when another might be true. It's a very, very, very clever take on this subject matter. It is horrendously dark. It's not a nice story. None of the stories in here are very nice. This is one thing I would say about this short story collection. It explores things like depression, things like schizophrenia, things like dementia, and it could be very, very triggering because it's written so well, because the situations are so real and the characters are so recognizable and so engaging. It could be very triggering indeed, but that's kind of the point. That's kind of the point. It is designed to make you engage with these very deep, dark subject matters. And it does it very, very bloody well, I've got to say. Broken on the Inside, the title story, is actually my favourite from the entire collection. But it's not all sort of down and dirty. There are some elements of dark humour here. There's also Discomfort Food, which is really well placed because that's the story that comes next, which is about a woman named Rebecca who works at a fast food restaurant, and it's kind of about that situation. It's about your working situation, your circumstances grinding you down on a psychological and emotional level until your perceptions of reality become broken, until you become something almost other in your own head. There's a surprise at the end of this one too. This one has a slightly comic element to it because of the imagery that it draws, very different tonally from the previous short story. But it is still extremely insightful. It's still about a very real and recognizable situation. One that many of us would probably recognize, and one that we've probably been in to some degree. All of us have done this. All of us have been in some shitty, awful job that we hate working, which is grinding us down on an emotional and psychological level. And that's what this is about. That's what it's about. It's not. There are elements that also stray into other areas, sort of like eating disorders and that kind of thing, but that's not really what the story is about. That is an element of it, but it's not really what the story is about. Again, I don't want to spoil too much. But it has a kind of a shift in the finale that's quite surprising, quite wrenching, and works very, very, very well indeed. I mean, another thing that this collection deals with, and I think this is very insightful, this is something that Laura Marrow dealt with as well in several of her short stories in Sing Your Sadness Deep. The Man Who Fed Foxes in Phil Sloman's collection is essentially about isolation. There's a very male element to this story. It's about sort of postmodern male alienation of grief, depression, of having no place or purpose in your life anymore, where circumstances have been wrenched from under you and you don't know where you are or who you are or how to define anymore. It's the lead in this one, a chap named Paul Wilson, is so identifiable, particularly for anyone who's ever suffered from depression or anxiety or isolation. This one is kind of the antithesis of the previous story. It is very powerful, very dark, and it's about grief. More than anything, it's about grief. And it is probably one of the more powerful stories in the collection, to be perfectly honest. It's quiet. It's much quieter than the other stories. There isn't any... The horror in this short story isn't the same as the horror in the others. It's nowhere near as overt. There's no real device or gimmick for the horror. It's just about the man and his circumstances and how he's responding emotionally to them. And I think this one, again, one of my favourites from the entire collection, The Man Who Fed Foxes, really beautiful, very, very grim, very dark, and because it's so identifiable. It's so identifiable. Beautiful story. And the next in the collection kind of follows on directly. There Was an Old Man, obviously named after the classic nursery rhyme. This one is about so much. There are numerous subtexts to this one, and it's difficult to be sure about what it's talking about. But it features a chap named John Hinklow, who he's an isolated old man. He's not particularly pleasant. He lives in a kind of filth. He's isolated, he's antisocial, paranoid, dislikes everyone around him. Again, very identifiable. I'm sure all of us listening to this will know someone exactly like that on their street or in their family or whatever. And what happens is John swallows a fly. He may not even, it's one of those situations where you don't know whether he's literally swallowed a fly or he's just imagined that he swallowed a fly. But he becomes very paranoid about it. He starts to imagine that the fly is alive inside of him, and he goes to the most extreme lengths to coax the fly out, to draw the fly out. You can imagine where it goes. I was surprised by this one. I thought it was going to be a more quiet tale about, say, dementia, or about just the slow decline of a rotting mind into ordure, into the mire. It's not that. It actually strays into some pretty unpleasant body horror territory at certain points. This one's probably the most overt in terms of its physical horror. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in this short story, a lot of imagery that is absolutely hideous. It's textural, you know? It's all about the descriptions of what this guy goes through, what he experiences, what sensations he imagines, the filth that he comes to occupy as a result of this, the stuff that he does to himself. It's probably the most overtly horrific of all the stories in this collection, I would say, and very effective as a result. And the final story, Virtually Famous. Now, this is the one that reminded me of Black Mirror the most. This one could easily be an episode of Black Mirror, so easily, and would work very, very well. It's about a guy named Chet Tyler, who's a massive star, and he markets this very peculiar thing. It's a virtual reality game in which people can experience being him, in which they can experience his lifestyle, or a kind of exaggeration and abstraction of that lifestyle. Phil is playing with some very big, profound postmodern ideas here. I mean, this is Baudrillardian, this is Simulacra and Simulacrum. It's about identity. There's even like a Philip K. Dick quality to this story, where because this guy shares his identity out, his identity itself starts to dissolve, and the identities of those who experience the virtual reality game start to dissolve around him. There's almost like a viral element to this experience. It's almost as though he's become, through this technology and through this experience, a cancer of identity. And it's really strange. It's very clever. Very bloody clever. And again, Phil Sloman is trying to comment upon the nature of identity and how fragile it is, how it can be broken down. But also, there is a certain commentary here about celebrity culture and about how narrow it is, how it tries to sell us images of particular lifestyles that are totally false. They're totally virtual, really. That's kind of what the story is trying to say. It's a very well written, very well constructed piece of science fiction horror, and it works very, very well. As a collection, Broken on the Inside, again, links below, is a superb piece of work. It really, really is. It's the kind of horror that ticks my boxes. It really ticks my boxes. I absolutely adore this kind of existential and psychological horror where very often, even as the reader, you're not sure what's real, and the protagonists certainly aren't, where perceptions of reality dissolve and the internal and the external break down and intermingle. They flow together and become a common, like an existential slurry. It's quite brilliant. It's quite a beautiful piece of work. As I say, links below. I would highly recommend it. I will add caveats to that, though. If you suffer with any kind of mental illness or depression or anything to that effect, you might want to check it out first before you dedicate yourself to it, because there are certain instances, situations, characters that you may find quite triggering in this. It is designed to be that. It is designed to give you some insight into particular kinds of mental illness, but also to explore existentialism. I mean, there is a wider philosophical conundrum going on here, or rather, a whole suite of wider philosophical conundrums. And it's a really good example of what horror can do when it's given a chance to, when you've got somebody who actually wants you to think, or actually wants to explore ideas with you. If you know things like your postmodern philosophy and whatnot, you'll get a lot out of this. You will see touch points, you will see references everywhere. It's a very, very cool collection, and I would highly recommend it. When next we come back, ladies and gents, who knows? I'm not sure. We may have a look at some more literature. We may have a look at some more cinema when we come back, ladies and gents. Until then, bye-bye!